April 13th, 1945. A cold wind moved across the farmland outside Farsleben, carrying with it the faint metallic groan of rail cars that had long since run out of steam. The train sat motionless on a slight rise above the Elbe River Valley, its black engine angled toward a war that was already lost. Inside the wooden boxcars, hundreds of prisoners, women, children, and the skeletal remains of once ordinary lives, pressed against narrow slits of light, trying to understand why the world had suddenly gone silent. On the embankment, German guards shifted uneasily. They had orders to keep the train moving east, yet the tracks ahead were cut, the fuel gone, and the rumble of American armor was closing from the west. Some clutched their rifles without conviction. Others watched the sky as if waiting for a verdict. Across the fields, dust swirled under advancing vehicles from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, their silhouettes growing clearer with each passing heartbeat. No one on the train knew what would happen next. Not the prisoners, not the guards, not the men in olive drab approaching a scene they had not expected to find. And this moment is where the story begins, poised between fear and a kind of kindness none of them had imagined. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe was collapsing faster than any commander could redraw it. Germany, once projecting power across a continent, was shrinking by the hour. The Soviet Red Army was closing in from the east, tearing through Silesia and Pomerania. From the west, American and British forces moved with relentless precision, breaking through the final defensive lines on the Rhine and driving deeper toward the heart of the Reich. Cities burned behind retreating German units. Bridges were demolished in desperate attempts to stall the inevitable. In this tightening vice, the Nazi leadership issued frantic directives to relocate thousands of prisoners from concentration camps threatened by Allied advance. It was a final, chaotic effort to prevent them from being liberated, and, in some cases, to hide the scale of atrocities. As a result, transport trains began departing from camps such as Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Dachau, often without clear destinations or sufficient supplies. Some trains were meant for camps farther east. Others were sent out simply to move prisoners away from approaching armies, regardless of where the tracks led. For the prisoners, these transports became moving coffins. Conditions inside the cars were suffocating: no sanitation, little water, and almost no food. Women fainted from dehydration. Children cried themselves hoarse until they no longer had the strength. Older prisoners slumped to the floor and did not rise again. Yet even in this darkness, the sound of distant artillery, American or Soviet, carried a strange dual meaning: fear of what the guards might do, and a fragile hope that someone was getting closer. Meanwhile, the German military machine was in full disintegration. Communication lines were severed, supply depots abandoned, and units moved without coordination. Orders from Berlin arrived late, contradictory, or not at all. Some officers still tried to enforce discipline. Others simply tried to survive long enough to surrender. For guard detachments supervising prisoner transports, the situation grew even more unstable. The guards were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that the regime they served was collapsing. But they still held the power of life and death over the people locked in those rail cars. Across the Western Front, American armored and infantry divisions pushed through central Germany with a focus on speed and operational clarity. Their objective was to capture strategic towns, secure bridges, and neutralize pockets of resistance before they could regroup. They were not searching for trains full of prisoners. Most soldiers had heard only fragments of reports about the camps. Few understood the scale of what they were about to encounter. As the 30th Infantry Division advanced northeast toward the Elbe River, their path cut through farmland, small villages, and scattered remnants of German forces. The division had fought its way across France, the Netherlands, and into Germany with a disciplined but weary determination. By April, they were seeing more surrendering German troops than active resistance. Yet every day still carried an element of uncertainty. Mines, snipers, isolated fanatics. The war was ending, but not yet finished. It was into this landscape that the lost prisoner train from Bergen-Belsen drifted, almost unknowingly. Thousands of Jewish prisoners, many of them women who had survived years of progressive deprivation, were herded aboard with no explanation. Some believed they were being taken to another camp. Others feared they were being moved to avoid liberation. No one knew how long the journey would last, or whether it had a real destination at all. The train lurched eastward, stalled, reversed, and stalled again. Fuel grew scarce. The locomotive crew had no reliable instructions. Guard morale deteriorated as the Americans drew closer. Hunger gnawed at prisoners and guards alike. Illness spread in the cramped cars. The once orderly system of oppression was breaking down amid the wider chaos of Germany's collapse. By mid-April, the train had been on the move for days, stopping unpredictably, sometimes sitting for hours on remote sections of track. At night, the temperature dropped enough for frost to cling to the wood. During the day, sunlight filtered through the slats, revealing faces hollowed by uncertainty. All the while, the countryside around them shifted. Columns of German refugees trudged along roads, bomb craters scarred the fields, and the distant thunder of tanks drew nearer with each dawn. The war was closing in on the train from all sides, and the people trapped inside it felt the tension building like a pressure that had no release. When the tracks finally ran out and the locomotive rolled to its last stop near the village of Farsleben, no one realized the moment they had arrived at the edge of liberation, and at the crossroads of human cruelty and unexpected compassion. It is from this tightening circle of desperation that the next layer of the story emerges. The train that would later be known simply as the Lost Train had departed Bergen-Belsen on April 10, 1945, carrying roughly 2,500 Jewish prisoners. Bergen-Belsen itself was on the brink of collapse. The camp was overcrowded, ravaged by disease, and starved of supplies. British forces were approaching rapidly, and German authorities issued orders to clear out thousands of prisoners before the Allies arrived. Not all transports had clear destinations. Some were directed toward camps deeper in Germany, others simply to move their human cargo away from liberation. This train was officially bound for Theresienstadt, though no realistic path existed to reach it. Tracks were severed or damaged, bridges destroyed, and German rail lines were crumbling. The locomotive crew likely knew this. Many of the guards certainly suspected it. Yet the train rolled out all the same, a final desperate attempt to keep prisoners under control while the Reich dissolved behind them. The guards assigned to the transport were a mix of SS personnel and auxiliary units, some of whom had been reassigned from other collapsing sectors. Their cohesion was fragile. Some were hardened veterans, others barely trained. Several had been on the front only weeks earlier. What united them now was exhaustion, uncertainty, and the growing realization that the war would not end in their favor. Their orders, to keep the train moving, maintain discipline, and prevent escape, became harder to enforce with each passing hour. Inside the boxcars, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Water ran out within the first day. Food supplies were insufficient even for the guards, let alone the prisoners. Many women were already weakened from years of camp life. Some lay unconscious or drifting in and out of awareness. Children clung to their mothers, whispering questions for which there were no answers. The train stopped frequently as German units retreated across the same rail lines, forcing delays. Each halt brought new fears. Was this where the guards would decide to abandon the prisoners? Or worse? The landscape through which the train passed had become a tableau of a nation unraveling. Villages were half empty, their inhabitants either fleeing or waiting for the war to wash over them. Burned-out tanks marked crossroads. Bridges were littered with destroyed vehicles. The thunder of artillery echoed from the east, while American air patrols swept overhead from the west. Every direction signaled collapse. By April 12th, the train reached an area where the tracks had been damaged by air raids and retreating German engineers. The locomotive could go no farther. Attempts to reroute were impossible. Alternate lines were already severed. The engineer informed the guards that the train could not proceed. The surrounding terrain offered little cover, only open farmland and scattered trees. It was a place where time seemed suspended, waiting for something to break the standoff. Tension within the guard detachment escalated. Some argued for marching the prisoners on foot. Others insisted on staying put until new orders arrived. A few, sensing the approach of American forces, considered desertion. Yet there remained rifles, uniforms, and the weight of authority. Even authority dissolving is dangerous in its final hours. For the prisoners, the halt brought a mix of dread and disorientation. They could hear distant engines on the wind. The guards were moving nervously. Something felt imminent. but no one could see what lay beyond the horizon. A few prisoners dared to peer through cracks in the wood. They saw only fields and empty air, but their instincts told them change was coming. Meanwhile, American troops of the 743rd Tank Battalion and supporting infantry from the 119th Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, were maneuvering eastward with speed. Their objectives had shifted as the situation evolved: secure crossings, push toward Magdeburg, cut off pockets of resistance, and stabilize sectors where German forces were still active. Reconnaissance units probed ahead, scanning for ambushes or roadblocks. What they found instead, on the morning of April 13th, was a plume of smoke drifting from a stationary locomotive. At first, it looked like another abandoned train. Germany was littered with machinery left behind in retreat. But as the armored column drew closer, figures began to take shape. Guards were visible on the embankment. More tellingly, men aboard tanks noticed movement inside the boxcars. Human shapes, dozens of them. Reports moved quickly up the line. A train full of civilians, possibly prisoners. No one knew yet that it contained more than 2,000 people. No one knew how long they had been trapped there. No one knew how close starvation and disease had pushed them toward death. Yet, in those first moments, as American forces slowed and German guards stiffened, the two stories, of those who had endured years of oppression and those who had enforced it, were about to collide under the gray April sky. A collision that would reveal far more than any soldier expected to witness. And from this convergence of war, humanity, and surrender, the first deeper angles of the story take shape. For the prisoners, the days leading to April 13th had become a blur of survival instincts and fading strength. The boxcars were never meant to hold this many human beings for so long. The air inside grew thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and damp wood. Many women had been transported before, moved from camp to camp, but this journey felt different. There was no clear direction, no destination, and no sense of order. Only motion, then stillness, then motion again. In the cramped space, bodies leaned against one another for balance. Some whispered prayers, others stared into the darkness, conserving every ounce of energy. Mothers rationed crumbs of bread for their children. Elderly women lay almost motionless, their breathing shallow. Every jolt of the train brought a momentary hope that they were moving toward liberation, or a fear that they were being taken somewhere far worse. Outside, the guards argued, but inside the cars, silence often prevailed. The prisoners could hear muffled voices, the clatter of boots on gravel, the low rumble of the locomotive struggling to pull a load it was never meant to carry. When the train finally stopped, the absence of movement was disorienting. Stillness in wartime could be as frightening as any explosion. Yet amid the exhaustion, a fragile thread of hope persisted. Some prisoners sensed that the front lines were shifting faster than the guards cared to admit. They saw the fear in the guards' movements, the uncertainty in their posture. They heard distant engines, louder each day. Something, someone, was approaching. And behind that distant sound, a possibility waited that none of them dared speak aloud. From the American viewpoint, the terrain around Farsleben offered nothing unusual at first glance. Rolling farmland, narrow roads, the occasional farmhouse. The type of landscape armored units had been crossing for weeks. Their priorities were operational: secure routes, locate enemy pockets, and keep momentum toward the Elbe River. The expectation was resistance, but of a collapsing nature, disorganized, sporadic, dangerous only in fragments. When scouts spotted the stationary train, their first assumption matched typical battlefield logic. It might be an abandoned logistical asset, a disabled transport, or, at worst, a concealed ambush point. Trains had been used by retreating forces to hide troops or explosives. Caution was necessary. As the tanks advanced, binoculars revealed more detail. German guards stood on the slope near the embankment. Some carried rifles but kept them lowered. Others seemed hesitant, scanning the horizon rather than preparing for combat. The posture was not aggressive, it was uncertain. Then came the realization that changed everything: movement inside the cars. Not the sharp movements of soldiers, but slow, weak motions, hands reaching through cracks, pale faces pressed against openings. American tank commanders radioed back. These are civilians, many of them. This altered the tactical landscape instantly. The Americans still had to approach as a potential hostile contact. The guards were armed, after all, but the mission shifted from engagement to assessment. Their priority became ensuring the safety of the vulnerable people inside those rail cars. Orders flowed down the line. Advance steadily. Do not fire unless fired upon. Identify the nature of the transport. Prepare for humanitarian response. It was a transformation the soldiers themselves had not anticipated that morning. From warfighters to witnesses of human suffering, they had not yet understood. Yet, even from a tactical lens, one fact became undeniable. The Germans were losing control of the situation. And in war, a unit that is losing control can become unpredictable. For the German guards, the sight of American armor approaching across the fields carried a weight that went beyond fear of capture. Many had served long enough to understand what the regime demanded of them, what punishments awaited failure, and what propaganda had claimed would happen if they fell into enemy hands. But now, with the locomotive stalled and the front collapsing, reality overrode ideology. Their authority was thinning, with every engine noise echoing across the valley. Some guards contemplated fleeing, others tightened their grip on their rifles but lacked the will to use them. A few attempted to maintain routine, pacing the tracks, calling out rigid commands that no longer carried force. They knew they could not execute the prisoners, not with American troops so close and the train entirely exposed. They knew they could not move them. They could barely feed themselves. The confusion became a form of paralysis. No one wanted to provoke a firefight. No one wanted responsibility for a massacre. Several guards exchanged glances that reflected a rare admission. The situation had passed beyond their control. Yet the most remarkable shift came not from fear, but from witnessing what they did not expect. When American tanks halted and soldiers approached, not with weapons raised but with caution, and when medics stepped forward, not with hostility but with urgency, the guards saw something they had been trained never to imagine. Enemy soldiers rushing to aid the prisoners. Some guards lowered their rifles instinctively. Others stared in disbelief. The contrast between the treatment the prisoners had endured and the sudden arrival of soldiers offering blankets, water, and care created a rupture in the worldview that had sustained their obedience for years. They had been taught that these prisoners were less than human, yet here were enemy troops treating them as though nothing were more important. And in that moment of collision between ideology and reality, the emotional core of this story began to take shape. In the stunned faces of guards who realized the war had already passed judgment on everything they believed. The next angles deepen these contrasts further, moving from the physical to the psychological, and from the tactical to the moral terrain revealed on that April morning. For the medics accompanying the 30th Infantry Division, the scene at the halted train unfolded with a rapid shift from battlefield readiness to emergency triage. When the first American soldiers opened the doors of the boxcars, a wave of heat and odor rushed out, the smell of confinement, sickness, and bodies pushed beyond human limits. Light poured into spaces that had been dark for days, revealing faces so gaunt they barely resembled the people they once were. The medics moved instinctively. They had training for battlefield wounds, blast injuries, and shock caused by combat. But this was different. Here, there were no gunshot wounds, no shrapnel. The injuries came from starvation, dehydration, typhus, untreated infections, and sheer exhaustion. Canteens were passed forward first. Not in large gulps, medics knew that sudden drinking could be dangerous to a starving person, but in small, steady sips. Water was life, but only when delivered carefully. Blankets were brought from the tanks. Soldiers handed over their own rations, then quickly stopped, realizing the food was too heavy for many prisoners to digest safely. So they adapted. They soaked crackers in water. They tore open medical kits to find glucose tablets. They lifted frail women from the boxcars with the same tenderness they had used days earlier to carry wounded comrades. Someone called for stretchers. Someone else ran to the supply trucks. A sergeant shouted for nurses, though none were present. Everyone improvised, driven not by orders, but by raw human instinct. Even officers who had spent years in disciplined battle formations paused, taken aback by the fragility of the lives before them. And above all, there was quiet. Not battlefield silence, but a reverent hush, the kind that fills a space when soldiers realize they are not confronting an enemy, but witnessing survivors of something far worse than war. This humanitarian response, unfolding in real time across a German field, set the stage for an emotional turning point the guards could not have anticipated. Liberation is often imagined as a moment of celebration, but for many prisoners on the Farsleben train, the first reaction was confusion. Trauma does not vanish the moment a door opens. Years of fear had conditioned them to expect deception, punishment, or danger behind any sudden change. When American soldiers approached the rail cars, offering water and blankets, some prisoners recoiled, unsure if this was real. Others reached out with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the presence of men who were neither shouting nor striking, but speaking gently and offering help. A few collapsed the moment they stepped into fresh air, not from weakness alone, but from the emotional release of realizing they were no longer under guard. Documented accounts of similar liberations consistently describe the same pattern: disbelief, tears, laughter that turned into sobbing, and long periods of stunned silence. Human beings emerging from prolonged captivity often needed time to understand that the nightmare had ended. Women who had endured years of degradation struggled to comprehend why American medics were kneeling beside them. Children clung to their mothers, uncertain whether these soldiers were another threat. Some prisoners wept without words. Others tried to stand straight, as though still expecting inspection. There were also moments of profound gentleness, prisoners touching the sleeve of an American uniform, as if verifying its reality, or holding a cup of water with both hands to stop it from shaking. This psychological shock of sudden safety created scenes that would stay with the American soldiers for the rest of their lives. But it also created moments that pierced through the hardened shell of the German guards who watched, witnessing reactions they had never seen inside any camp. And among these reactions, one stood out: the quiet, overwhelming collapse of a woman who experienced kindness for the first time in years. A moment that struck one of the guards with unexpected force. That moment becomes the emotional hinge of the climax to come. The presence of American soldiers caring for the prisoners created a moral contrast so profound that even the German guards could not escape it. For years, the Nazi system had normalized dehumanization. Prisoners were treated as labor, as numbers, as burdens, anything except human beings deserving compassion. Now, in the open daylight of a collapsing Reich, the guards saw something they had been conditioned to believe was impossible: enemy soldiers treating Jewish prisoners with more dignity than they had ever shown. A few guards looked away, unable to reconcile what they were witnessing. Others stared, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. One guard, standing near the embankment, reportedly asked another what the Americans were doing. The act of providing care was that foreign to him. This moral collision did not erase years of brutality, nor did it absolve those involved, but it cracked something open. When a guard watched a female prisoner break down in tears as an American medic wrapped her in a blanket, his posture changed, not out of sudden virtue, but because the image contradicted the ideology that had shaped his service. It presented a truth he could no longer deny. The system he had served was collapsing not only militarily, but morally. The Americans had not come to punish these prisoners. They had come to save them. And the guards, powerless in that moment, stood witness to a reality that marked the beginning of an irreversible reckoning. It was in this tension, between collapse and compassion, between surrender and salvation, that the story reached its decisive turning point. The standoff at the Farsleben train unfolded without a single shot fired, yet the tension in the air carried the weight of an entire collapsing world. As the first American infantrymen approached the embankment, rifles held at the ready but not raised, the German guards tightened their formation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and fully aware of it, but habit, training, and fear kept them in place. A lieutenant from the 30th Infantry Division stepped forward, signaling for the guards to put down their weapons. The Americans did not know how many Germans were present, but it did not matter. The guards saw the tanks. They saw the infantry spreading into a loose arc across the field. They saw the medical corpsmen tending to prisoners before speaking a word to them. It was clear the Americans controlled the ground. One of the senior German guards hesitated, glancing at the cluster of prisoners watching from the boxcar doors. Surrender meant survival. Resistance meant annihilation. And the moral authority of the moment, the sight of enemy soldiers kneeling beside women the guards had treated as expendable, carried a silent pressure. Finally, with a slow, almost resigned motion, he unbuckled his sidearm, placed it on the ground, and lifted his hands. The rest followed. Rifles were lowered, helmets came off. A few guards stared at the earth as though unable to meet the eyes of anyone around them. The surrender was total, quiet, and heavy. With the guards disarmed, the focus shifted fully to the prisoners. American soldiers moved from car to car, forcing open heavy doors swollen by weather and age. Each door revealed another group of gaunt figures, blinking into daylight. Some reached out instinctively, hands trembling. Others shielded their faces, unsure whether the sudden openness was a trick. The medics prioritized the most vulnerable: children unable to stand, women whose legs collapsed beneath them, prisoners burning with fever. Among them was a woman in her mid-30s, thin, pale, but with a posture that suggested she had spent years forcing herself to remain upright. When the door opened, she stepped forward carefully, gripping the wooden frame for support. Her hair was matted from sweat and confinement. Her eyes were sunken but alert. She scanned the scene with a mixture of suspicion and exhausted curiosity. An American medic climbed onto the rail car, extending a hand. She stared at it for a moment. Kindness, after years of degradation, was almost incomprehensible. Still, she allowed him to help her down. Her legs trembled violently when they met the ground. The medic steadied her, pressing a blanket into her arms, one of the few the unit carried. He guided her toward a small group where water was being distributed in careful sips. But before she reached the others, she stopped. Her knees buckled, her shoulders shook. The blanket barely held, slipped from her fingers. She began to cry, not loud sobs, but a silent convulsive release that robbed her of balance. It was as though the weight of years, compacted into the confines of a train car, had broken open all at once. A private knelt beside her, catching her before she fell. The medic steadied her again, murmuring quiet reassurance. Across the field, one of the disarmed German guards watched. He had been among those closest to the prisoner cars throughout the journey. He had seen these people as burdens, orders to follow, duties to perform, faces to ignore. Now, watching a woman collapse because an American had offered her a blanket, he froze. His eyes followed the scene with a stillness that belied the chaos inside him. The woman's breakdown was not dramatic. It was not staged. It was raw, human, and painfully real. And the reaction of the Americans, support without hesitation, gentleness without calculation, pierced through a worldview shaped by years of indoctrination. He looked at the prisoners differently in that instant, not as the categories he had been taught to enforce, but as people responding to kindness with a depth of emotion he had never witnessed. The war had not ended yet for Germany, but for him, something else had ended at that moment, the false certainty that the brutality he served had any claim to righteousness. The American lieutenant walked past the guard, now seated on the embankment under watch. The guard did not look up. His gaze remained fixed on the woman, who was now being supported by two soldiers as they guided her toward the makeshift triage area. The lieutenant paused only briefly, then continued, unaware of the internal collapse occurring just a few feet away. For him and his men, the priority was clear: save as many lives as possible before nightfall. For the guard, the priority had become something else entirely, processing the unmistakable truth that the people he had guarded with suspicion and contempt were being treated with more humanity by the enemy than he had ever shown. And as the sun shifted higher, illuminating the chaotic scene of liberation, the emotional climax of this moment settled across the field, a collision between desperation, compassion, and the final unraveling of the beliefs that had sustained a brutal system. The momentum of this scene carries directly into the next, where liberation expands beyond the first moments and the full transformation of the day unfolds. As the initial shock of surrender and liberation settled over the field near Farsleben, the scene widened into a complex tapestry of urgency, disbelief, and quiet transformation. American soldiers moved with practiced coordination, forming a humanitarian perimeter where minutes earlier there had been only tension between armed forces. Every soldier seemed to understand instinctively that this was no ordinary military encounter. The battlefield rules shifted into something more delicate, something sacred. Medics organized a triage area on a patch of level ground. Blankets were laid out, canteens lined in rows, and rations assessed for what could safely be given. A few soldiers jogged back toward the tanks, searching for spare clothing, coats, or anything that could serve as makeshift bedding. The field, cold that morning, now filled with clusters of people being tended to by men who had woken expecting combat, not rescue. The woman who had collapsed earlier was brought to the triage area. She was placed gently on a blanket, her breathing shallow but steadier now. A medic checked her pulse, then eased a small amount of water to her lips. She blinked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the brightness. A soldier offered her another blanket. She touched it carefully, feeling its softness as though confirming it was real. For her, warmth had been a memory more than a sensation. Around her, similar scenes unfolded. A mother clutched her child as an American soldier wrapped both in his own jacket. An elderly woman attempted to stand on unsteady legs until a medic guided her back down, assuring her she was safe. A teenager, who had entered the war long before he became a man, stared at the soldiers with a look that hovered between gratitude and incomprehension. American officers surveyed the surroundings, noting the scale of the disaster. More than 2,000 people needed attention. Food supplies would not last. Vehicles were limited. Medical personnel were few. They radioed back to request support: field medics, ambulances, and any available transport. A relief effort began to form spontaneously around them, driven by necessity and compassion. At the same time, the German guards sat in a guarded cluster near the tracks, under watch but unbound. Their faces revealed a spectrum of reactions. Some stared straight ahead, trying to maintain the hardened composure expected of them. Others looked at the ground, avoiding the scene unfolding nearby. A few watched the Americans, puzzlement etched deeply into their expressions. The guard who had witnessed the woman's breakdown remained seated, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the triage area. Something inside him seemed to have fractured quietly. He had seen prisoners cry before, from exhaustion, fear, or punishment. Tears were not unusual in the camps or on the march. But this was different. These tears came not from terror, but from the shock of unexpected kindness. He had never seen someone cry because they had been helped. It unsettled him, not because he lacked the capacity for emotion, but because the moment illuminated a truth he had never allowed himself to consider. The cruelty of the system he served had not been inevitable. It had been a choice he had lived inside, without questioning. Now, faced with the raw humanity of the scene, that choice confronted him with its consequences. Across the field, American soldiers carried prisoners from the cars in their arms. Some carried 2 at a time. A sergeant from the tank battalion looked over the line of rail cars and called out for bolt cutters. Several doors were jammed shut. When the last one opened, prisoners inside shielded their eyes from daylight, emerging slowly as though unsure the world outside would accept them. The guards watched all of this unfold, powerless to intervene and unable to look away. What struck them most was the absence of hatred in the Americans' actions. The soldiers did not shout. They did not gloat. They did not punish. Their movements carried urgency, not anger. Their focus was entirely on the prisoners. The guards were incidental, no longer feared, no longer obeyed, simply present. This calm authority unsettled those who had lived by force. As the sun rose higher, the medics began identifying the most critical cases. Several prisoners were near collapse after days without proper food or water. Typhus loomed as a deadly threat. The Americans knew they had to act quickly. They organized transports to take the sick to nearby villages where temporary medical stations could be established. Soldiers escorted small groups of prisoners along the road, supporting them under the arms. The woman with the blanket was slowly lifted to her feet and asked if she could walk. Her legs trembled, but she nodded. A private stayed beside her, matching each step, ready to catch her if she faltered. For years, she had moved under compulsion. Now she walked because someone cared whether she fell. Behind them, the German guard watched her go, his expression hollow, but not from fear of capture. Something else was happening, an unraveling of the ideological armor he had worn for years. The scene in front of him was not an argument or a speech. It was a simple, undeniable truth playing out in real time. Humanity extended freely, without expectation, had more power than the cruelty that had defined his service. And as the last of the prisoners stepped off the train, receiving help from hands once considered enemy, the full magnitude of the moment settled across the valley. The war was not yet over on paper, but for everyone present, something monumental had shifted. A turning point, written not through violence, but through an act of compassion that revealed everything the regime had tried to suppress. The consequences of this moment, for the liberated, for the soldiers, and for the guards, would echo far beyond the fields of Farsleben. In the hours following the liberation of the Farsleben train, the American forces confronted a humanitarian crisis that was far larger than they had anticipated. The numbers became clear only as the prisoners were counted, stabilized, and guided away from the boxcars. More than 2,500 people, many barely able to walk, all in urgent need of medical care. What began as a battlefield encounter swiftly became one of the most significant rescue operations carried out by the 30th Infantry Division during the final weeks of the war. The first priority was to remove the prisoners from the rail cars and create space for medical assessment. Soldiers improvised shelters using canvas, tarps, and whatever equipment they could spare. A gentle breeze carried the scent of spring through the valley, a stark contrast to the stale, suffocating air from inside the boxcars. Prisoners sat or lay in small clusters, wrapped in blankets, drinking water slowly under the careful supervision of medics who watched for signs of refeeding shock. The Americans quickly realized that no single unit could manage the crisis alone. Messages were sent to nearby divisions, requesting ambulances, medical personnel, and vehicles for transportation. The response was swift. Jeeps and trucks began arriving from multiple directions, forming an impromptu convoy that would ferry the weakest individuals to nearby villages temporarily converted into care centers. Local German civilians, stunned by the scene, watched from a distance as streams of liberated prisoners passed through their streets. Many had known the war was nearing its end, but few had understood the scale of suffering that had occurred inside the concentration camps scattered across their own country. Now, confronted with lines of skeletal survivors supported by American soldiers, denial became impossible. The Americans commandeered buildings, schools, community halls, barns, turning them into emergency shelters. Wells and water pumps were activated, and villagers were ordered to provide bedding, clothing, and basic supplies. Under the oversight of U.S. officers, food was collected and distributed in controlled portions to prevent illness. Doctors moved among the newly housed survivors, checking fevers, bandaging wounds, and isolating cases suspected of carrying typhus. Throughout the day, soldiers returned repeatedly to the train site to ensure no one had been overlooked. They lifted unconscious individuals from the shadows of rail cars. They carried those too weak to move. They searched the fields in case anyone had collapsed while trying to walk. Every life, they understood, mattered. Back at the tracks, the German guards who had surrendered remained under watch. Their weapons had been collected, and they sat in a silent row, no longer an authority over anyone. American soldiers questioned them briefly, names, ranks, unit affiliations, but beyond that, the guards received little attention. The priority was the prisoners. The guards were simply held in place, awaiting transport to POW facilities once the most urgent humanitarian tasks had been handled. The guard who had witnessed the emotional collapse of the woman earlier in the day remained quiet, answering questions mechanically. He looked occasionally toward the field where the triage continued. It was no longer fear of punishment that unsettled him, but the undeniable reality of what he had seen, an act of compassion breaking through the brutality he had lived within, exposing a truth he could not dismiss. By evening, the field near Farsleben had transformed from a place of desperation into a scene of controlled, coordinated relief. Fires were lit to warm those who shivered under their blankets. Medics worked in shifts. Soldiers handed out more water, more softened rations, more reassurance. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with muted colors as though the landscape itself were exhaling after a day of relentless intensity. The prisoners rested, some sleeping for the first time in days, others too overwhelmed to close their eyes. The Americans kept watch, maintaining a calm perimeter not for battle, but to protect the vulnerable from uncertainty. And as the light faded, the weight of what had happened began to settle into memory. Lives had been saved. A transport destined for suffering had been halted. A moment of human kindness had rippled outward, changing the course of a day, and the course of countless futures. But the full story of what followed, the long road to recovery, the fate of the guards, and the historical reverberations of this single moment was only beginning to unfold. In the days following the liberation, the survivors from the Farsleben train began a slow, fragile recovery. American officers documented the scene carefully, recording names, conditions, and immediate needs. Their reports would later serve as vital historical testimony, confirming both the scale of the suffering and the extraordinary nature of what had been prevented. For many of the prisoners, this moment marked the first step toward reclaiming identities that had been stripped away by years of persecution. From the makeshift shelters in nearby villages, the survivors were gradually moved into more stable care. Some were relocated to former German military barracks cleared for medical use. Others were sent to Hillersleben, a larger facility capable of handling severe cases. There, U.S. Army doctors fought against dehydration, malnutrition, and infectious disease. Many prisoners recovered slowly, some recovered miraculously. A number, tragically weakened beyond reversal, succumbed despite every effort. Their deaths, among the first in freedom, underscored the prolonged brutality they had endured. Yet for most, physical strength began to return. Hair was washed for the first time in months. Clothes were distributed. Clean bedding replaced the hard slats of the rail cars. Food was reintroduced with caution and consistency. The sounds of the war still echoed in the distance, but for these survivors, the nightmare of captivity had ended. Among them, women who had arrived unable to stand found themselves regaining balance. Mothers who had feared their children would not survive the journey now watched them sip broth or sleep peacefully on clean blankets. For many survivors, the memory of the moment of liberation, the opening of the train doors, the arrival of American medics, the first human touch offered without harm, became an anchor in the decades that followed. When they later gave testimonies, many described the day near Farsleben as the moment life began again. Meanwhile, the consequences for the German guards diverged sharply. After their surrender, they were processed as prisoners of war and transported to holding areas for interrogation. Their fates depended on their roles, their rank, and the degree of evidence linking them to war crimes. Some guards attempted to minimize their involvement, claiming they had merely followed orders. Others remained silent, but the Americans had little sympathy. The treatment of the prisoners spoke for itself, and the collapse of the Nazi administrative system meant that records, testimonies, and physical evidence would soon illuminate the full scope of actions taken at camps like Bergen-Belsen. For the guard who had watched the woman fall into tears at the moment of liberation, the days after the surrender were marked by a heavy, contemplative silence. He was questioned like the others, then placed among hundreds of POWs awaiting further processing. But something inside him had changed irreversibly. The simplicity of the act he had witnessed, a blanket offered, a woman overcome by relief, had forced him to confront truths he had avoided throughout the war. No interrogation could weigh as heavily as the realization he carried that humanity had been present all along in the people he had guarded, and he had failed to recognize it. In the wider context of the war, the liberation of the Farsleben train became one of the most documented and photographed rescues of the final months in Europe. The 30th Infantry Division's discovery stood out not for its scale alone, but for its timing, coming just days before the official collapse of Nazi Germany. It revealed, with stark clarity, what had remained hidden behind the Reich's crumbling military lines, a machinery of suffering that continued operating even as defeat loomed. News of the rescue spread through Allied channels, contributing to a growing understanding of the humanitarian devastation inside German territory. Reports from other liberated camps, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Dachau, were arriving simultaneously. But the Farsleben transport was unique in its circumstances. A mobile concentration camp intercepted at the last possible moment, with every life on board hanging in the balance. For decades afterward, survivors would recall the moment American soldiers approached their train as one of the most profound turning points of their lives. Some kept blankets given to them that day. Others remembered the faces of specific soldiers, a medic handing them water, a private helping them walk, an officer assuring them they were safe. These memories, passed down to children and grandchildren, became part of the broader story of liberation in 1945. And as history recorded the aftermath, it became clear that what happened near Farsleben was not just a military event, but a deeply human one, a moment where compassion confronted cruelty and changed the trajectory of thousands of lives. From this, the narrative moves toward reflection, a calm examination of what this liberation meant, not only for those present, but for the world that inherited its memory. History often remembers wars through the movements of armies, the decisions of generals, and the shifting borders carved by treaties. But sometimes, the meaning of an entire conflict is revealed in a single, quiet moment. A moment not defined by strategy or firepower, but by a human gesture that cuts through the noise of war. The liberation of the Farsleben train was one of those moments. On that cold April day in 1945, there were no speeches, no triumphant declarations, no flags raised over a conquered city. There was only the sight of starving prisoners stepping into the light, the sound of American medics offering calm reassurance, and the collapse of a woman who had carried years of fear inside her bones. In that simple, fragile reaction, a guard saw something he could not unsee: the undeniable truth of another person's suffering, and the equally undeniable truth of compassion offered without hesitation. This encounter did not end the war. It did not undo the years of brutality that preceded it, but it illuminated with unmistakable clarity what was lost in those years and what could be regained in the space of a single act of kindness. For the survivors, that moment became a dividing line between darkness and life. For the American soldiers, it became a memory that shaped their understanding of why they fought. For the guards, it marked a confrontation with their own humanity, a realization that the power they once held had dissolved, replaced by a reckoning far deeper than military defeat. And for us, looking back across the decades, it offers a reminder that the most enduring legacies of war are not always found in the aftermath of victory, but in the moments when compassion reasserts itself against overwhelming cruelty. Thousands of lives were carried forward from that field near Farsleben, lives that built families, communities, and stories that would ripple into future generations. Their survival stands as quiet testimony to a truth as old as conflict itself, that even in the final hours of a collapsing world, the smallest act of humanity can break through and change everything it touches.